The night before his death, General George S. Patton could not sleep. The war was over. The medals were won. Europe lay silent beneath winter snow. Yet witnesses later said he looked like a man still trapped on an invisible battlefield, a commander pacing trenches no one else could see. Hours before the crash that would end his life, he sat in the passenger seat of a staff car, staring out at the frozen countryside of occupied Germany. No explosions, no gunfire, no tanks rolling past. Only the hush of victory, a silence far louder than war. "This is a hell of a way to die," he muttered. Not in glory, not in motion, not with purpose, but parked in a world that no longer had a place for him. Records show he should have been safe. Rear echelon territory. No threats, no enemy patrols. Yet the most feared general of the European theater was suddenly exposed, not to bullets, but to irrelevance. He once raced armies across continents. Now he was being slowly erased by conference tables, diplomats, and caution. In his last hours, he spoke more like a man exiled than a hero retired. Those around him believed the story was over. Patton knew something had been taken from him. He had not lost a war. He had lost the right to finish one. The car rolled forward through the mist. Trees blurred past the glass. The road ahead was empty, yet Patton leaned forward like a predator scenting trouble. Old instincts don't retire. They haunt. Then, in that quiet car, came the first hint of dread. This wasn't how a legend is supposed to end. He once said a soldier must either move forward or die. But now he was being kept still, frozen in the one state he feared more than death itself. Waiting. The world believes Patton's final battle was fought long before this road, long before this morning. But what if the truth is different? What if his real enemy wasn't across the Rhine, but sitting above his own signature line? Powerful men who looked at him and didn't see a hero. They saw a threat that could no longer be controlled. If a general can frighten his enemies, he is dangerous. But if he frightens his superiors, he becomes disposable. A chill passed through the car glass. He didn't shiver from the cold. He shivered because he had seen this ending before, not in war, but in history. Famous warriors do not die when they are defeated. They die when they become inconvenient. He stared through the winter fog, as if watching fate assemble itself like a convoy on the horizon. Deep down, he sensed it. Something was waiting for him just beyond this stretch of road. And within seconds, history would stop pretending he was still untouchable. Part 1 ends here. We are seconds before the impact moment. The staff car rattled forward across a frostbitten road outside Mannheim. Patton leaned slightly to the right, pointing out a pair of birds lifting from a tree line, the kind of small motion a soldier notices when he is still half at war. The driver looked away for only a moment. That was all it took. A lumber truck appeared through the fog, sudden, silent, impossible to brake for. Metal screamed. Glass burst inward. The world folded. The car buckled like a crushed tin helmet. Patton's head snapped forward into the steel frame. A single instant, enough to break the spine of a man who once broke armies. No enemy, no battlefield, no glory. Just a collision no one ever truly explained. Witnesses say the truck appeared as if out of nowhere, almost like something that was never meant to be investigated. But before the silence settled, we cut backwards, not by minutes, but by years, to a different road, a different war, and a very different Patton. Dust, heat, engines roaring like thunder. Sicily, 1943. Patton stands atop a ruined bridge, fists clenched, jaw locked, staring at the horizon as if he might tear it open by will alone. His tanks should already be advancing, devouring ground before the Germans can reorganize, but they are frozen in place, not by enemy steel, by orders from Washington. He doesn't hide his fury. He was built to attack, and here he was leashed. Men around him shift nervously. They are not scared of the Axis. They are scared of disappointing him. Patton didn't inspire by comfort. He inspired by momentum. To stall was to rot. To hesitate was to invite death. And this is where the story truly begins. Because this moment, this bridge, this delay, is the first sign of the contradiction that would later kill him more effectively than bullets ever could. The enemy feared his advance, but his own command feared his momentum. Battles can be won on maps. Wars are won by men who do not wait for permission. So the question is not how Patton died. The question is when his death truly began, on that icy German road, or on this scorching Sicilian bridge, the day he first proved he could win too fast for politics to control. Patton did not become relentless on the battlefield. He became relentless long before he ever wore stars on his collar. In childhood, in isolation, in a quiet war with his own weaknesses. He was born into wealth, yes, but not softness. His family line carried a legacy of warriors, ancestors who fought in the Civil War, the Mexican-American War, and the Revolution itself. He grew up not playing soldier, but rehearsing destiny. By age 12, he wasn't reading fairy tales. He was memorizing Caesar, Scipio, Alexander the Great, not as myths, but as benchmarks. But the strange truth buried beneath the legend is this. Patton's first enemy wasn't Germany. It was shame. As a child, he suffered severe dyslexia. Letters twisted. Words mocked him. He could barely read without stumbling. And in a household of legacy, failure was a ghost that stalked him daily. That's why he trained like a man chased by something he couldn't outrun, because metaphorically he was. When the world later called him aggressive, they never understood that he learned early. Stillness felt like suffocation. If he wasn't advancing, he was falling behind. This is where his obsession with speed was born, not from doctrine, but fear of slowing down long enough for doubt to catch him. When he entered West Point, he wasn't the polished genius people now imagine. He was a furious work in progress, a man who forced discipline into his bones the way a blacksmith hammers steel. His classmates remembered him studying, standing up, because stillness made him restless, training until his knuckles bled, because improvement could never be enough. They laughed until he outran them. That became a pattern in his life. Mocked first, feared later. Patton's worldview wasn't built in lectures. It was built in the cavalry, the old frontier army, where speed meant survival and hesitation meant dying thirsty in the wrong canyon. There, he didn't just learn warfare, he learned identity. A mounted soldier doesn't wait. A mounted soldier doesn't ask permission. A mounted soldier moves first or never moves again. Motion is victory wasn't slogan. It was biography, but something deeper crystallized inside him. The belief that fear itself could be harnessed. When men feared him, they moved before panic could freeze them. When his enemies feared him, they retreated before they fired. He didn't worship brutality. He weaponized certainty. The army admired him, but the institution feared what that certainty might become. Because a man who refuses to slow down is also a man who refuses to wait for approval. He was rising, but shadows were also rising against him. Even in training camps, older officers whispered, "He moves too fast. He thinks too independently." Men like that skip the chain of command. One superior wrote privately, "Patton is effective, but dangerous if given too much leash." That was before he ever led a single battlefield campaign. Before North Africa. Before Sicily. Before Europe learned his name in terror. He was already being profiled, not as a hero, but as a risk. This is the part of the story most documentaries skip. He didn't become controversial. He entered history already marked as a question the army wasn't sure it wanted answered. The irony is brutal. The same personality that would later save American armies was the same personality his superiors were quietly preparing to restrain. And that quiet restraint, those early murmurs of caution, would one day return in a far deadlier form. Because systems don't fear chaos from enemies. They fear chaos from within. So here is the question that begins to shadow him. The question that becomes his fate later. Can a system built on hierarchy survive a commander who outruns hierarchy itself? That is the seed of the tragedy. The public saw a warrior. The army saw a wildfire. A hero to soldiers. A threat to structure. The beginnings of a storm, invisible but gathering. Soon, war would give him the stage he was forged for. But it would also give his critics exactly what they needed. proof of how unstoppable and uncontrollable he really was. And once a man like Patton proves he can win without waiting, someone eventually decides he must never be allowed to win too much. That unspoken collision between genius and control is what will drag him towards Sicily, and later, into something far worse. What most people never realize is that Patton didn't simply study war. He rehearsed it like a lifelong prophecy. Long before tanks, long before Europe, he believed speed would decide the next era of combat. Where his peers memorized formations, he memorized momentum. Where others learned discipline, he learned shock. Not just to defeat an enemy, but to unbalance him. But this obsession came with a cost. He was always alone in the room mentally, already 10 miles ahead of everyone else, living in the next battlefield while others were still discussing the map. This is why the cavalry fit him, for a while. But when the world mechanized, everything changed. Patton saw tanks not as machines, but as horses made of steel. Where older generals argued over whether armor belonged in infantry support, Patton saw a new kind of warfare, combat decided by motion before contact. Victory earned before the first shell landed, because panic would set in before defense could form. Most officers thought tanks were lumbering battering rams. Patton believed they were arrows. Fast, precise, terrifying. He studied engines the way others studied maps. He studied psychology the way others studied supply chains. In private notes he wrote, "The fastest army is the deadliest. The one that makes the enemy feel hunted before shot is fired. That is not strategy, that is predation. And predators aren't managed easily." It's here the first cracks appear between Patton and the system that would one day muzzle him. He wasn't trying to build an army that reported well. He was trying to build an army that moved well. Traditional command rewards caution. Patton rewarded decisiveness. Traditional generals rehearsed procedures. Patton rehearsed fearlessness. And fearlessness is disruptive, especially inside a system built on fear of mistakes. So when the first real test of his beliefs arrived, the Mexican expedition of 1916, the army did not expect him to become a headline. They expected him to learn patience. Instead, he learned the opposite. Patton led one of the first motorized raids in U.S. military history, engines roaring where horses once thundered. He hunted Pancho Villa's commanders with the speed of a wolf pack, shooting first, shocking always. It was only a small taste of war, but it confirmed what he suspected all along. Speed breaks morale faster than bullets. Reporters photographed him standing over enemy bodies with his pistols still hot, not posing, not grandstanding, simply refusing to hide what war truly looked like. To soldiers, it was proof of courage. To Washington, it was a red flag. A man who moves too fast becomes independent. A man who moves independent becomes unpredictable. And an unpredictable general is harder to politically leash. They promoted him, but also began watching him. Because in military culture, rising stars are not only groomed, they are also measured and whispered about, not failures, potential future problems. Patton could already sense it, that invisible friction, that unease when men with rank, but not courage, stood near him. He did not fear them, but he recognized them. He saw in them the threat his ancestors warned him about. The greatest danger to a warrior is not the enemy in front of him, but the coward behind him who has authority. He had not yet met the political machine head-on, but he could smell it. And war, a real war, was coming. A war that would finally give him room to run, but also give his superiors their first taste of what he looked like unrestrained. And once they saw it, really saw it, they would never stop fearing him again. By the time Europe slid toward crisis again, Patton was no longer a man studying war. He was a man waiting for it. Waiting not like a spectator, but like a blade still sheathed, restless for purpose. His peers wanted rank. He wanted velocity. They wanted order. He wanted opportunity. And fate, brutal, indiscriminate fate, was about to hand him exactly that. World War II began as a shock to the world, but to Patton, it was confirmation. The world wasn't changing. It was catching up to him. Blitzkrieg wasn't a revelation to him. It was validation. The Germans had simply discovered the doctrine his mind had been living inside for years. Shock first, overwhelm second, occupy later. Where others saw a threat, Patton saw a mirror. But if the outside world was finally aligning with his instincts, the inside world, the bureaucracy, the chain of command, was tightening. A system built on seniority now required decisiveness, yet feared the very personalities capable of it. And into that contradiction, Patton walked like a storm. He trained troops like he was forging an invasion force decades before the invasion even existed. He drilled speed so hard that hesitation felt like treason. Soldiers said that under Patton, your boots didn't walk, they answered to him. He was not merely teaching war. He was manufacturing mindset. And here is where the gap widened. Commanders saw readiness. Washington saw unpredictability. Enemies would one day see inevitability. So the collision course was already set, long before North Africa, long before Sicily, long before controversy. It was never about what Patton did. It was always about what he was capable of if left unchecked. He didn't just train warriors, he awakened them. He didn't create soldiers, he forged predators. He believed brutality wasn't born on the battlefield, cowardice was. And cowardice, once present in command structure, was deadlier than artillery. That belief would drive him to greatness. It would also paint a target on his back. Because a system can tolerate talent. It can tolerate victory, but it cannot tolerate a man who makes the system itself look slow. And that's the root of Patton's tragedy. He was not shaped by war. He was merely revealed by it. The world was about to meet him on open terrain. And for a brief, terrifying moment, the Allied command would see exactly what happens when you unleash a man built to conquer momentum itself. They would need him. They would use him. And then they would fear him. Because once lightning strikes on the battlefield, someone, somewhere, always tries to find a way to bottle it. That bottle would be called politics. And eventually, politics would do what no enemy army ever could. North Africa did not begin as Patton's victory. It began as America's humiliation. In early 1943, the U.S. II Corps had been shattered at Kasserine Pass. Green troops had broken under pressure. Command was confused, slow, reactive. It wasn't just a defeat, it was an embarrassment. British commanders whispered that Americans were undisciplined amateurs. German generals wrote that U.S. forces were soft. Morale bled out faster than men. And this is the moment the high command made a decision they would later regret. They called George S. Patton. He did not arrive like a savior. He arrived like a storm front. The first thing soldiers heard was not a speech, not encouragement, but the sound of engines. His convoy barreled into camp like he was invading his own army. He stepped out of his vehicle in polished boots, riding crop in hand, pistol on his hip like a cavalry officer who had somehow dragged the 19th century straight into mechanized war. He didn't smile. He didn't greet. He inspected silently. A commander with warmth can be liked. A commander with silence can be feared. And fear was exactly what this broken corps needed. He replaced hesitation with shock. He replaced confusion with ritual. He replaced hope with discipline. Uniforms fixed. Helmets strapped. Weapons clean. Posture straight. His first order wasn't tactical. It was psychological. No more retreat. A man who shows readiness in appearance will eventually show readiness in action. The troops thought he was posturing. He wasn't posturing. He was rewiring morale. But the real transformation wasn't in how he dressed men. It was how he replaced their shame with fury. He didn't remind them they lost. He reminded them someone believed they would lose. And that belief was a deeper insult than the defeat itself. He turned humiliation into fuel. And that is why Patton's presence terrified both friend and foe. He understood psychology as a weapon. He knew men who fear dying break. Men who fear failing him do not. The Germans had Rommel. The Americans, after North Africa, would have something rarer. A commander who weaponized speed of belief before speed of armor. But before Patton could strike the enemy, he had to strike something more dangerous. The doubt that had metastasized inside his own ranks. And he did it with the same method he would later use on entire panzer divisions. Momentum shock, certainty, before the firing even started. Yet behind all this victory in the making lurked the shadow he could not see yet. Every success here would prove his doctrine correct, and that would make him harder to stop later. And men in Washington were already uneasy with that idea. The enemy feared Patton. But soon, so would his allies. Because once lightning starts crossing a battlefield, someone always asks the question, who controls the lightning? For now, they needed him more than they feared him. But that balance would not last. When Patton finally turned his eyes toward the Germans, it wasn't revenge he brought with him. It was momentum sharpened into a blade. He didn't merely intend to push the Afrika Korps back. He intended to erase the memory of Kasserine so violently that no German officer would ever again call American troops soft. The first offensive under his command moved like a lightning strike, someone forgot to announce. Radio chatter fell silent. Marching formations tightened. The tempo of the entire corps changed. Recovery wasn't gradual, it was explosive. Patton didn't tell them they were better. He made them feel faster, deadlier, more alert than the men who humiliated them weeks before. Then came the moment every soldier remembered. Patton ordered a full-scale advance, not just to reclaim ground, but to force the Germans to feel hunted for the first time. For months, Rommel's men stalked U.S. troops like predators. Now the roles inverted, not on paper, but in their stomachs. In their diaries, German officers wrote something chillingly simple. The Americans change. They push without waiting. This was Patton's success in purest form. He changed how the enemy felt before changing what the enemy saw. Speed first, impact second, fear third. That was the order of battle. What stunned observers wasn't just that Patton advanced, it was how early he did it. Most generals waited for confirmation. Patton acted the moment a window opened. He believed hesitation was death measured in hours, or worse, an initiative surrendered forever. This is why his reputation spread faster than his armor divisions. German scouts radioed not positions, but warnings. They weren't tracking troops. They were tracking Patton. And here lies the turning point, the moment that made Allied command admire him publicly and worry privately. Because a general who wins faster than expected does something dangerous to hierarchy. He shows that the delay came from the top, not the battlefield. He proved a frightening truth. The enemy wasn't the bottleneck. Command politics was. For the first time, Washington saw their problem clearly, and it wasn't Rommel. It was what Patton represented, a commander who didn't need permission to win. Every success in North Africa wasn't just a step toward victory. It was another mile widening the gap between Patton the asset and Patton the threat. The German High Command updated its intelligence briefings. The Allied High Command updated its contingency plans. The public thought he was rising. The men above him were already calculating how far they would let him rise before they would have to contain him. As his troops pushed deeper across North Africa, something unusual began happening on the battlefield. The Germans started reacting to Patton before they even confirmed he was there. Reports came in of Axis units abandoning defensive lines early, shifting armor at the first rumor of his presence. Not tanks, rumors. That is when morale doesn't just bend, it collapses. This is how you know a commander has crossed from strategy into myth. The enemy stops fighting your soldiers and starts fighting your shadow. Patton didn't defeat the Germans faster. He defeated them earlier, in their minds, before steel clashed with steel. And soldiers felt this shift too. He was no longer simply their general. He was their proof that they were not who the enemy said they were. From humiliation to hunter in weeks. But for every mile he gained in desert sand, his critics gained an inch in political ground. They didn't talk about mutiny or recklessness or loss of control. They used softer, colder words. He is ungoverned. He acts without pause. Is becoming bigger than command structure. Translation, they feared not what he failed to do, but what he could so easily succeed at without them. Meanwhile, his troops didn't fear him out of terror. They feared letting him down. A soldier once said, "You don't fight for your life under Patton. You fight to deserve being led by him." That psychological grip is rare. It is also threatening to the men above him. Because a general who captures soldier loyalty captures leverage. The troops would follow him into fire before they would follow a memo. And that kind of loyalty cannot be controlled, only feared. There is a moment historians often skim past, but it is the real pivot of the Patton legend. One night, while reviewing maps, he slammed his fist down and said quietly to a staff officer, "Rommel beat amateurs. I will make sure he fights an army." That wasn't confidence. That was identity. I will not let America be underestimated again. And within days, the lightning effect became doctrine. Marches shortened. Attacks accelerated. Artillery followed momentum rather than schedule. The U.S. 2 Corps went from stumbling rookies to the fastest-moving unit in the theater. The British stopped mocking. The Germans started adjusting. Washington started worrying, because this is when they finally understood what they had unleashed, not a reinforcement, not a battlefield general, a system breaker, a man who, if left alone, would not only rout the Axis, he might rewrite how wars were fought. And when someone's influence grows faster than their leash, someone eventually tries to shorten the leash. Not because he is wrong, not because he is reckless, but because once lightning touches the ground, everyone suddenly remembers how dangerous it is to hold. North Africa wasn't just where Patton won battles. It was where he made himself necessary. And that is the most dangerous thing a man can become to a political machine. Because everything necessary eventually becomes uncontrollable. And uncontrollable things, systems plan to contain them. Long before they admit it, the moment finally came, the collision everyone was waiting for. Patton versus Rommel. Two minds built for momentum. Two predators who believed victory was seized before contact. But there was a cruel twist of history. Rommel wasn't even on the field that day. He was ill, recovering in Germany. And yet, Patton still spoke to him through gunfire. He studied Rommel's book, Infantry Grafed and Infantry Attacks, line by line, until he understood not just how Rommel fought, but how he thought. When the engagement began, Patton wasn't improvising. He was countering the playbook of a man he had never physically faced, and still defeating as if they stood eye to eye across the battlefield. When his tanks broke through and the Afrika Korps buckled, Patton shouted, "Rommel, you magnificent bastard! I read your book." Men later said it wasn't arrogance. It was recognition. Apex predator acknowledging apex predator. This was not a tactical win. This was a psychological transfer of dominance. In that moment, the desert stopped belonging to Rommel and became Patton's territory, a battlefield of recursion flipped upside down. For months, the Germans had stalked American troops. Now, they were prey. German intelligence logs from this period contain a stunning line. If Patton is present, assume attack before orders confirm it. They weren't studying his army anymore. They were studying his nature. That is when a warrior becomes something more than a general. He becomes a reference point. But every rise casts a shadow. The Allies publicly praised the victory. Privately, concern hardened into caution. Because this single victory answered a terrifying question. What happens if Patton is given full freedom? The answer was now obvious. He becomes unstoppable. And unstoppable men cannot be managed. They can only be limited. From this moment forward, the Allied command no longer asked, "Can Patton win battles?" They began asking a different, quieter question. Or do we keep him used, but never unleashed? The desert had proven two truths at once. Patton was the sharpest weapon the Allies had. A weapon that sharp could also cut through the hand that wields it. This is the paradox that would follow him into Sicily, into France, and eventually into tragedy. His victory made him a hero in the eyes of his men, and a liability in the eyes of his superiors. North Africa didn't just forge his reputation. It triggered the quiet beginning of the containment plan. A storm had been unleashed, and somewhere in London and Washington, someone was already asking, when the war is over, what do we do with a man like this? Patton had done the impossible. He had taken a defeated army and turned it into a spear pointed straight at the Axis. Soldiers who once doubted themselves now marched like they were owed vengeance. And that transformation carried a scent the Germans recognized instantly: inevitability. But inevitability is not a comfort to politicians. It is a warning. Because now there was no denying it. Patton didn't just win battles. He made victory accelerate. And acceleration makes leaders nervous. It exposes how slow their decision-making truly is. After North Africa, word traveled through every Allied briefing room: Patton is the only general the Germans actively fear. That should have been a compliment. Instead, it registered as a threat profile. When he walked into operations headquarters after the campaign, conversations didn't hush, they tightened. Not resentment, calculation. Not jealousy, containment instinct. Here is the part most documentaries soften. Patton was already marked. Not for punishment, not yet, but for monitoring. Not because of what he had done, because of what he might do next. Then came Sicily. The next campaign was supposed to be a formality. Montgomery's showpiece, a British-led advance with American support. Patton was placed in a supporting role for optics, not strategy. They wanted him present, but not dominant. Useful, but not decisive. They were trying to position him as a tool. But a force of nature is not a tool. Sicily would become the first battlefield where Patton wasn't just fighting the Axis. He would be fighting ceiling. The leash was already tightening, just not visibly yet. And this is where the story turns. In North Africa, Patton was unleashed against the enemy. In Sicily, command would try to unleash him only as far as politically comfortable. But Patton did not believe in comfortable war. He believed in finishing war. And because he wouldn't slow down for Berlin, he would soon collide with London, Washington, and fate. His tanks would move too fast. His victories would embarrass the wrong men. And soon, for the first time, his greatest obstacle would not carry a German flag. It would carry a signature block. The general too dangerous to bench, and too useful to ignore. By the time Sicily ended, Patton had done something no one in Allied command expected. He outran the plan. His advance was so fast, so unrestrained, that he beat Montgomery to Messina and humiliated the British timetable in the process. Soldiers celebrated. The public cheered. But high command did not. Because here was the problem, spoken quietly in polished conference rooms. If Patton can rewrite the battle plan, what else can he rewrite? The army never feared losing control of his troops. They feared losing control of him. And so, for the first time, instead of being promoted upward, Patton was deliberately slowed downward. The leash became visible, not in orders, but in absence of orders. He was too famous to remove, too valuable to sideline outright, too unpredictable to trust. So they invented a fourth option. Patton would become a symbol instead of a commander. A myth they could use instead of a weapon they couldn't contain. This is the birth of Operation Fortitude. But its real beginning wasn't a strategy meeting in London. It began the day Allied command realized something terrifying. The Germans feared Patton more than any army. Not Eisenhower, not Bradley, not Montgomery. Patton. There came a moment, not loud, not dramatic, not recorded in dispatches, when Patton finally understood what had been done to him. It did not happen in combat. It happened in stillness. A briefing room in England. No urgency. No maps pushed across tables. No invasion timetable with his name on it. He was in command of nothing. He had stars on his shoulders, but no battlefield beneath his feet. A lion-wearing rank, treated like stage decoration. And that silence was louder than artillery. This was the first time in his entire military life that Patton felt something he could never admit publicly: powerless. Not because he lacked orders, but because his presence was the order. He wasn't moving an army. He was the bait. This was the moment humiliation stopped being theoretical and became bone deep. Because a warrior can tolerate delay, injury, exhaustion, but to be needed as a symbol while denied the right to act. That is a deeper wound than shrapnel. He began noticing little things, meetings he was excluded from, decisions made without him, then explained afterward. Commanders who praised him in speeches but avoided him in planning rooms. Leaders don't isolate generals they trust. They isolate generals they fear. He once said, Courage is fear holding on 1 minute longer. But now he faced a different kind of fear, not German artillery, American caution. The enemy still thought they were hunting him. The truth was worse. His own side had already caught him. The cage had no bars, but it had boundaries. No walls, but limits. In that isolation, another darker realization surfaced. One that haunted him more than Rommel ever could. They don't intend to use me. They intend to contain me. What happens to a predator when the hunt is taken away? What happens to a blade when no one will draw it? Some officers are cooperative. Patton had become dangerous by existing. His brilliance was not the reason he was sidelined. His independence was. Because a man who can think faster than high command can also act faster than high command. That is the real threat. Not his temper, not his rhetoric, not his ego, his velocity. A fast-moving commander becomes a fast-moving decision-maker. And that unchains the battlefield from politics. And politics always tries to reclaim its leash. So when D-Day arrived, history's most famous invasion, the greatest field general the U.S. possessed, watched it from a distance. Not because he wasn't ready, not because he wasn't capable, but because success had made him untouchable and therefore untrustworthy. The Germans still prepared for Patton to strike. The Allies prepared to make sure he didn't. Victory wasn't his enemy. Victory was the reason he was imprisoned. And somewhere deep inside, one terrible thought began to echo. If they can block me from Normandy, what else will they block me from? The answer would come soon, and it would be the beginning of the slow, quiet downfall of the most feared general in Europe, not at enemy hands, but friendly ones. Isolation is not measured in miles. It is measured in purpose or the lack of it. Patton was surrounded by men, by staff, by ceremony, and yet he was utterly alone. The world still saluted him, but the salute no longer meant command. It meant containment disguised as honor. Every sunrise reminded him. He was watching someone else's war. He paced headquarters like a caged animal, restless, enormous, misplaced. The press still adored him. The troops still whispered his name like a promise. The enemy still braced for him instinctively. Only his own side treated him as dangerous cargo. That is when the humiliation turned inward. The unstoppable force had been forced to stop, and worse, to pretend this was strategy, not sidelining. A warrior can endure defeat. What he cannot endure is irrelevance. And for a brief, bitter moment, Patton faced the one truth he had never trained for. He was no longer needed, only feared. If someone had told him years earlier that success could one day disarm him more effectively than any enemy, he would have laughed. But now, seated on the edge of a campaign he was forbidden to shape, the laughter was gone. He had become the only thing more tragic than a restrained general, a restrained legend. Symbolism cannot bleed. Symbolism cannot advance. Symbolism cannot change the outcome. That was the first death, the silent one. The death before the crash. The Germans, still terrified of him, kept panzers waiting in the wrong sector for weeks after D-Day, expecting his assault at Calais. His absence won half the invasion before the first boot hit sand. He had played a decisive role, yet touched no battlefield. Imagine Rommel learning the truth. The man he feared most was not the spearhead. He was the decoy. That realization would have cut colder than defeat. But Patton never wanted to be a weapon of illusion. He wanted to be a weapon in motion. And fate, impatient with containment, soon gave him that opening, because even the political leash had limits. Once Normandy took hold and the beachhead secured, momentum began to outrun bureaucracy. The Allies needed speed again. They needed a hunter again. They needed lightning again. And lightning has a name. Patton got the call. The muzzle was loosening. The storm was returning. But a different question now lingered beneath his orders. Would they unleash him to win, or unleash him only long enough to use him again? He would soon find out, in the fields of France, where his legend would return, but so would the leash. Isolation is not measured in miles. It is measured in purpose or the lack of it. Patton was surrounded by men, by staff, by ceremony, and yet he was utterly alone. The world still saluted him, But the salute no longer meant command. It meant containment disguised as honor. Every sunrise reminded him. He was watching someone else's war. He paced headquarters like a caged animal, restless, enormous, misplaced. The press still adored him. The troops still whispered his name like a promise. The enemy still braced for him instinctively. Only his own side treated him as dangerous cargo. That is when the humiliation turned inward. The unstoppable force had been forced to stop, and worse, to pretend this was strategy, not sidelining. A warrior can endure defeat. What he cannot endure is irrelevance. And for a brief, bitter moment, Patton faced the one truth he had never trained for. He was no longer needed, only feared. If someone had told him years earlier that success could one day disarm him more effectively than any enemy, he would have laughed. But now, seated on the edge of a campaign he was forbidden to shape, the laughter was gone. He had become the only thing more tragic than a restrained general, a restrained legend. Symbolism cannot bleed. Symbolism cannot advance. Symbolism cannot change the outcome. That was the first death, the silent one. The death before the crash. The Germans, still terrified of him, kept panzers waiting in the wrong sector for weeks after D-Day, expecting his assault at Calais. His absence won half the invasion before the first boot hit sand. He had played a decisive role, yet touched no battlefield. Imagine Rommel learning the truth. The man he feared most was not the spearhead. He was the decoy. That realization would have cut colder than defeat. But Patton never wanted to be a weapon of illusion. He wanted to be a weapon in motion. And fate, impatient with containment, soon gave him that opening, because even the political leash had limits. Once Normandy took hold and the beachhead secured, momentum began to outrun bureaucracy. The Allies needed speed again. They needed a hunter again. They needed lightning again. And lightning has a name. Patton got the call. The muzzle was loosening. The storm was returning. But a different question now lingered beneath his orders. Would they unleash him to win, or unleash him only long enough to use him again? He would soon find out, in the fields of France, where his legend would return, but so would the leash. When Patton returned to active command after Normandy, it wasn't a gentle reentry. It was a detonation. France didn't receive him. France was split open by him. His arrival on the front line felt less like reinforcement and more like a fuse being relit. This time the leash came off not out of trust, but out of desperation. The Allied advance was slowing. Terrain, logistics, planning committees, all the invisible mud that bureaucracy drags onto a battlefield, had begun to choke momentum. So they turned once again to the man who believed war should feel like outrunning the enemy's breath. And Patton delivered exactly what they feared he would: speed without apology. He didn't just move the Third Army. He threw it forward. Town after town collapsed like dominoes punched by artillery. But the real weapon wasn't steel, it was tempo. Civilians said Patton's troops appeared out of nowhere. German officers said, "It is as if his army does not sleep." Intelligence reports described his advance with a word almost never used in formal military writing: relentless. This wasn't maneuver warfare anymore. This was pursuit warfare, prey running before it bleeds. In less than 2 weeks, he advanced farther than some armies had in 2 months. Bridges? Improvised. Fuel? Captured. Roads? Created by will. His supply officers begged him to slow. He didn't. Logistics didn't drive him. Momentum did. And momentum is contagious. Morale in his forces rose with frightening speed, because Patton's confidence wasn't motivational, it was gravitational. Men didn't believe they would win. They believed they already had, and all that was left was to collect the evidence. Meanwhile, in German command bunkers, panic sharpened. Reports show they shifted entire divisions in reaction to rumors, not sightings, of Patton's location. To them, he was not a general. He was a moving catastrophe. But in Allied headquarters, the mood was different. A whisper took root. If he reaches the Rhine faster than planned, who looks obsolete? Success makes certain men legendary. It makes other men nervous. Because Patton was once again exposing a dangerous truth, that bureaucracy had been slowing the war more than the enemy. He was not outpacing the Germans. He was outpacing permission. And the faster he moved, the closer he slid toward the same invisible wall he had hit in Sicily. Only this time it would appear not as delay, but as a strangling of supplies. The first leash was rank. The second leash was politics. The third leash would be fuel. A general cannot be ordered to stop if he never slows. So they didn't order him to stop. They starved his speed. But before that chokehold hit, France witnessed what Patton always believed war should be: a storm that does not wait, does not pause, does not ask approval. The enemy braced for a battlefield. What they got was an arrival. And buried inside that arrival was a question that someone in command was already thinking. A question darker than strategy. If he ends the war too fast, what then? Because a man who wins without them is a man they may not be able to control after victory either. And systems always fear what they cannot control. The deeper Patton drove into France, the clearer the pattern became. The Germans weren't breaking from casualties, they were breaking from pressure. He was collapsing their will to resist faster than their lines. But the faster he moved, the more isolated he became from his own command. At first it showed up as delays, requests for more fuel, more ammunition, more trucks processing. Logistics officers started giving him rehearsed answers instead of real ones. The supply convoys suddenly slowed to a crawl. Bridges reported as under review. Approvals pending. It wasn't the enemy that stalled him. It was the paperwork. The greatest armored advance of the Western Front, put on pause by men in clean uniforms who never left headquarters. Even his staff could feel it. Someone somewhere had decided Patton needed a speed limit. Not because he was failing, but because he was succeeding too fast. The unofficial message was clear: slow down, or you will outrun the rest of us and embarrass the chain of command. Here is the quiet truth history books soften. High command wasn't afraid he would lose. They were afraid he would win alone. Because if Patton reached Germany first, if he crossed the Rhine ahead of schedule, if his army shattered the final barrier, then he wouldn't just be a war hero. He would be a kingmaker, a man history could credit with shortening the war, a man the public would elevate beyond the brass, a man no committee could ever diminish again. And powerful institutions do not like men who can rise outside the hierarchy. So they choked the only thing they could: his momentum. Fuel became political currency. Authorization became a leash. Victory became rationed, measured, supervised. His tanks sat waiting, not for mechanics, not for terrain, not for reconnaissance, but for permission to keep being victorious. Patton paced like a storm fenced in by barbed wire. His men felt it too, the unnatural stillness. Troops trained for motion chafed in place. Predators forced to perch. This, not the German army, was the beginning of his breaking point. Because a battlefield can be conquered. A rival can be outfought. But a leash? A leash must be cut, and cutting it makes you an enemy of the hands that hold it. Patton wasn't just running out of fuel. He was running out of room to be himself. The Germans were retreating. His own command was tightening. France was becoming his triumph and his warning. Because this wasn't interference anymore. This was a message: you may win, but only on our timeline. A warrior can survive being outnumbered. What he cannot survive is being outmanaged by his own side. And soon, that leash would turn from tactical inconvenience into strategic sabotage. If there was one truth Patton never tolerated, it was paralysis. So when the fuel strangulation slowed his advance, he did not wait. He hunted forward anyway. He took captured German fuel. He redirected convoys. He used speed like a weapon and desperation like a fuse. Where another general would have written reports, Patton wrote distance. He gambled that the faster he advanced, the harder it would be politically to pull him back. A paused army is easy to leash. A charging army is a headline. And headlines are ammunition a bureaucracy cannot easily shoot down. Once more, German intelligence misread what was really happening. They believed his speed meant endless supply and carefully coordinated logistics. The truth was far more dangerous. He was outrunning permission itself. And this time, Berlin panicked. Entire German formations folded early, convinced Patton would cut through them, before reinforcements arrived. Rumors of his approach triggered withdrawal orders. Units retreated from positions not because of casualties, but because of history repeating itself. They had seen him in North Africa. They had seen him in Sicily. Now, they saw him in France and assumed there was no point standing in his way. But with every mile he gained on the enemy, he lost a mile with his own command. The friction was no longer quiet. It was sharpened. Bradley admired his results, but feared the political fallout. Eisenhower valued his fire, but dreaded the day that fire caught command structure instead of enemy armor. And in London, one concern began circulating behind closed doors.
If Patton reaches Germany first, we lose control of the peace that follows. This was the line no general is ever supposed to cross, the invisible threshold where winning is treated as a liability. Because armies fight wars, but governments own the aftermath. And if one man becomes the symbol of victory, he becomes more powerful than the architects of the treaty. That is unforgivable in politics. So they made a decision, a quiet one. If Patton could not be slowed indirectly, he would be slowed directly. The next phase of containment would not be logistical. It would be narrative. And public narrative is deadlier than supply lines because it strikes reputation, not resources. Patton was about to learn something brutal. A general can outrun tanks. He can outrun enemies. He can even outrun caution. But he cannot outrun politics hunting him from behind. Soon, they wouldn't just drag his advance. They would drag his name. The battlefield was no longer his only front. The conference room had entered the war. And that enemy does not retreat. Patton's army was not stopped by the Wehrmacht. It was stopped by a meeting. No battlefield. No artillery. Just a quiet room full of officers who had already decided the war must not end at Patton's pace. Officially, the justification was logistical balance. Unofficially, the fear was political imbalance. His success was becoming a gravitational center. Soldiers rallied to him instinctively, the public adored him instinctively, and even enemy intelligence behaved as if he were inevitability made flesh. That level of symbolic power does something fatal inside a hierarchy. It begins to overshadow the architects. And institutions never tolerate being overshadowed by the weapons they deploy. So the same command that once begged him to save the front now treated him like something that needed managing. And the punishment? Not demotion, not replacement. Something colder. Visibility without authority. He was told to hold, then hold a little longer, then await coordination, then prioritize stabilization. In war language, these sound operational. In political language, they mean, stop before you become untouchable. This was Sicily all over again, only bigger, sharper, more deliberate. Not accidental leash, engineered leash. Every victory began creating its own backlash. For the first time, Patton understood the full, ugly truth. He wasn't being trusted to win. He was being permitted to win, and permission could be revoked at any time. The enemy across the field feared defeat. The command behind him feared precedent. If Patton crossed the Rhine first, if Patton liberated a major German city first, if Patton became the visible hammer of final victory, then Patton wouldn't just be a general. He would become a narrative the system could no longer edit. And in that moment, he stepped unknowingly onto a collision course not with Germany, but with history's most powerful censor, political self-preservation. The final blow in France wasn't a bullet or a blockade. It was bureaucracy smiling while clipping his wings. Soldiers saw a pause. Headquarters saw a correction. Patton saw the trap closing. For the first time, he wasn't fighting the Axis. He was fighting gravity, the gravitational pull of a system designed to consume its own heroes before they outgrow the leash. What he didn't know, not yet, was that this wasn't the end of his containment. It was only the practice run. The real silencing, the final one, was still ahead of him. And when it came, it would not unfold on a battlefield. It would unfold on a road. A quiet road. In winter, after victory, the day lightning was no longer needed and therefore no longer safe. By late 1944, France was not just liberated, it was outpaced. Patton didn't simply break through German defenses. He broke through the tempo of the war itself. Strategy meetings couldn't keep up with him. Committees were constantly reacting to things he had already accomplished before they even scheduled the briefing. That is when the upper command realized the most threatening part of Patton wasn't his aggression. It was his efficiency. A man who wins too cleanly exposes how slow everyone else is. The Germans called him the Hammer, but the Allies began to call him, in private, the Problem. A successful general makes others look capable. A legendary general makes others look replaceable. And that is the point where legacy becomes threat. Command didn't need to defeat him. They only needed to slow him until someone else could arrive and claim co-ownership of his victories. If he crossed into Germany first, history would belong to him. So the leash tightened not because he faltered, but precisely because he hadn't. The final humiliation of this phase came quietly. A transfer of fuel priority from Patton's Third Army to Montgomery's. No gun. No reprimand. Just a pen redirecting momentum. That administrative signature did more damage to his advance than any German division. It wasn't sabotage of his performance. It was containment of his legacy. He wasn't just being slowed. He was being contextualized. The message had hardened. You may help us win, but you will not be allowed to define the win. This is the moment in every legendary life when the hero realizes something irreversible. The system that uses you will, eventually, also fear replacing you. And what cannot be replaced must eventually be removed. Not publicly, not loudly, but inevitably. From here on, Patton was not merely fighting a war. He was racing a clock counting down not to German defeat, but to the moment they no longer needed him. Every mile closer to the Rhine was also a mile closer to irrelevance, because once enemies collapse, politics inherit the battlefield. And politics do not share glory. They erase it. If the Germans were his battlefield enemies, then peace would become his final one. And peace is merciless to men built from motion.